This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend Coffee, available at hollywoodblends.com. Everyone's saying it's the best coffee they've ever tasted. Why not give it a try and see for yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest is an author, narrator, director, broadcaster, and filmmaker who also happens to be the daughter of one of the greatest legendary composers and conductors the world has ever known, Leonard Bernstein. He's been immortalized by the genius of his many iconic compositions. His Broadway shows On the Town, Wonderful Town, Candide, and West Side Story, the film score to the movie On the Waterfront, and his magnificent timeless operas, symphonies, ballets, and theater pieces, including Trouble in Tahiti and the sequel, A Quiet Place, Prelude, Fugue and Riffs, Symphony Number 1, Jeremiah, Mass, a theater piece for singers, players, and dancers, Symphony Number 3, Kaddish, Dybbuk, Songfest, Divertimento, and Arias and Barcarolles. And his renowned, groundbreaking young people's concerts turned all of us into music lovers. Our guest writes and narrates educational concerts all around the world, not only about her father in the Bernstein beat, but also about Mozart, Aaron Copland, Stravinsky, and other great composers. She's produced and hosted the New York Philharmonic's live national radio broadcasts, as well as many summer broadcasts from Tanglewood and educational concerts for the New World Symphony in Miami. She also narrated the highly acclaimed podcast, The NY Phil Story, Made in New York, and she co-directed the multi-award-winning documentary film entitled Crescendo, The Power of Music, which celebrates the amazing social transformation that happens when children from disadvantaged urban communities participate in youth orchestra programs. Our guest has dedicated her career to perpetuating and honoring her father's legacy. In addition to presenting the Bernstein Beat concerts, she created and edits a newsletter called Prelude, Fugue and Riffs to keep the international community of Leonard Bernstein fans connected. In 2018, our guest released her highly compelling, fascinating, and poignant book entitled Famous Father Girl, a memoir of growing up Bernstein. And she and her two siblings, Alexander and Nina, provided much input into the making of the brand new film about their father called Maestro, starring Bradley Cooper, which is now showing on Netflix. I'm delighted to welcome Jamie Bernstein to our show. Jamie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Harvey.
Now, Jamie, I have to say, after reading your book, that you had one of the most adventurous and glamorous childhoods that I've ever heard of. One of your classmates in second grade named Lisa called you Famous Father Girl. Did it bother you growing up that you couldn't just be a regular kid at school?
It did bother me somewhat that I couldn't just disappear into the ocean of normality as I perceived it and be just like all my other friends, and that it made me uncomfortable to be sort of selected out because I had this famous father, which is why Lisa called me that, to tease me. Famous father girl. And that made me a little uncomfortable. And I always just wanted to be normal. That was always my aspiration as a kid. It was not to be.
No, that's for sure. There was a whole parade of iconic people who drifted in and out of your house when you were growing up. People like Richard Avedon, Mike Nichols, Betty Comden, Adolph Green, Lillian Hellman, Stephen Sondheim, Isaac Stern, Lauren Bacall, and I'm just scratching the surface. Who were some of the most interesting people that you really connected with?
Well, first of all, I have to preface all that by saying that, when you're a little kid, you have no frame of reference for who your parents' friends are. They're just your parents' friends who come over for dinner or to spend a weekend in the country house. You don't know who they are in the world. So it was only later on that it began to dawn on my brother and sister and me that these friends of our parents were really quite astonishing in what they contributed to the world. But for us, they were just our parents' friends who were reliably hilarious and affectionate and very nice to the three of us. And we loved being around them. In particular, I would say that Mike Nichols was a real favorite of us because he was just so funny and so affectionate and fun to have around.
I read that your first experience of classical music was with Bugs Bunny cartoons. Is that right?
Sure, that's true for everybody in my generation. We all were first introduced to classical music because that was what we heard on all our Bugs Bunny cartoons, that, they would put actual orchestras onto the soundtracks of all those cartoons that we loved so much and watched every single day of our lives. Then my next introduction to classical music would have been my father's young people's concerts, which he began when I was 5 years old.
Your parents were close to President Kennedy and his wife Jackie, and your dad dedicated his symphony Kaddish to JFK, which your mom narrated, but it got mixed reviews. Do you think that with the passage of time, Kaddish has become more appreciated by the critics and the public?
Well, all I can say about Symphony Number 3 Kaddish is that I grew to appreciate it more. It came out when I was about 10 or 11. And so I was very young, and the music in Symphony Number 3 Kaddish is quite thorny. There's a lot of 12-tone music in it. That means the category of music that doesn't have melodies and isn't in an identifiable key and is, dissonant and challenging to our ears that are used to more melodic tonal music. So there's a lot about the music in that symphony that's challenging. Plus, our mother's narration, the narration that my father wrote for our mother to present in its premiere, was also challenging for my brother, sister, and me, because our mother was using her big stage melodramatic voice. And that made us feel very self-conscious and, oh, why does Mummy sound so weird? So it took me decades to discover that actually the music in this symphony is fantastic.
Is it true that your dad wrote the song A Quiet Girl from Wonderful Town as a lullaby to you?
It is true that Quiet Girl is a kind of lullaby to me because my father was writing Wonderful Town just around the time I was born. So I was an infant while he was composing the score, and Quiet Girl is a sort of lullaby for me, but it's quite ironic that he wrote Quiet Girl for me, because if there is one adjective you would not use on my behalf, it's quiet.
Well, I don't think anybody would want you to change one iota of your personality, but I think it's really cool that you have a lullaby written for you.
And it's such a beautiful piece. I love that song. It's so beautiful.
Now, of course, everyone loves West Side Story, but you said your dad wasn't a huge fan of the movie. Why not?
Oh, well, he didn't advertise his misgivings about the film because he consciously gave the task of transferring the show to film to someone else when it came to the arrangements. And so that all went to a guy called Johnny Green. And my father was too busy with the rest of his life going on the road, conducting the New York Philharmonic. And he had so much else on his plate that he literally didn't have the time to attend to how the music made the transfer from the Broadway pit to the silver screen. So Johnny Green did that. And any misgivings or criticisms that my father might have had about how that worked out, he kept to himself because he gave it to someone else to do. But he wasn't always happy with those transitions.
What do you think he would have thought of the Steven Spielberg remake?
Oh, I think he would have loved it. For one thing, musically, you could not hope for the score of West Side Story to sound better than it does in Spielberg's soundtrack. It just sounds so marvelous. It's gorgeously performed and conducted by Gustavo Dudamel, largely. And it just sounds like $1,000,000. And it's beautifully sung as well.
Yeah, I think so too. In the fall of 1964, your dad took a sabbatical from being the music director of the New York Philharmonic so he could do more composing. He was going to create a new show with Comden and Green based on the Thornton Wilder play, The Skin of Our Teeth, but nothing came of it. Did you ever find out why?
I don't know why the Skin of Our Teeth project failed. I don't really know what happened. It just wasn't taking off. Maybe the subject matter was a little too earnest and it wasn't taking advantage of that antic quality that Betty and Adolph could bring to their musical comedies. Maybe it was just the wrong choice of material for the three of them, but I'm just speculating. I don't really know why it didn't work out. But how fortunate it was that just when it failed, my father was invited by the Dean of Chichester Cathedral, Dean Walter Hussey, to write a piece for was it their bicentennial? I think it was some big, event, festival that Chichester Cathedral was celebrating. And he asked my father if he might write a piece, and under ordinary circumstances, I think my dad might not have accepted that invitation. But because it came at the end of this sabbatical year, my father said, okay, I'll do it. And Walter Hussey asked my father, could whatever you write, could it please sound a lot like West Side Story? And so I think my father actually agreed to do that. And in fact, one little section from Chichester Psalms is the thrown away first attempt at the opening number of West Side Story. Did you know that?
No, that's so cool.
It's the middle movement when the men sing that very menacing section. In Hebrew. Why do the nations rage is what they're singing that psalm. And the original version of that for West Side Story went, make a mess of them, make the sons of bitches pay, make a mess of them, there'll be less of them. They cut that from West Side Story and it wound up in Chichester Psalms.
That is so cool. Now, in 1965, your dad took you to meet the Beatles backstage at the Ed Sullivan Show. And in fact, your dad often incorporated pop music into his young people's concerts to illustrate his points about composition, which is really so groundbreaking. And it was so meaningful to me as a kid. He even made a TV show about rock music. Which other contemporary artists besides the Beatles did he like?
Well, he was a big fan of pop music. The whole thing about my father's relationship to music was that he loved all kinds of music as long as it was terrific. And there was a lot of terrific pop music. So he loved Motown. He loved the Rolling Stones. He liked them more than I did in the beginning because he understood what their roots were. I didn't know anything about, blues from the South, but my father knew all about it. He wrote his college thesis about those early records that were coming out of the South, Leadbelly and Robert Johnson and all that really early blues stuff. He knew all about it. So when he heard the Rolling Stones, he knew exactly what they were nodding at with their own music making. So he thought the Stones were great. He loved the Kinks because there was that song, You Really Got Me. And he loved it so much that he used that one in one of his young people's concerts. He went to the piano and he played and sang You Really Got Me by the Kinks to demonstrate the Mixolydian mode.
What an amazing man. Your dad had a lot of respect for Michael Jackson's musicality. The night before your dad got a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Grammys, you and your dad had dinner with Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones. Do you have any memories of that night that you can share with us?
Oh, I don't have too many memories of that night. We were all kind of dizzy from it all. It was very splashy. And I sat at the other end of the table to allow my father and Quincy and Michael Jackson to all be able to sit together. So I wasn't even a part of their conversation that night. I just didn't even want to impose myself on that triumvirate. I just let them have their moment.
So you were a little bit of a quiet girl.
That night I was. I think I was overwhelmed myself, frankly.
I can't even imagine. Now, a lot of people today may not know that your father was a passionate supporter of human rights and civil rights organizations. You've mentioned his college thesis, which was entitled The Absorption of Race Elements into American Music. He conducted the orchestra at Bobby Kennedy's funeral. Were you at that funeral?
Yes, I was. And it was a very intense day because it began with some sort of bomb threat to us or something. And so we had to get to the funeral with a police escort. And everything was very tense and strange. And this funeral took place at St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York City. And we were all very anxious and it was all very sad and intense. And that's all I remember. My father conducted the Adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which is, the saddest and most beautiful piece of music in the world, possibly. And so it was very moving when he performed it. And he received a beautiful letter afterwards from Jackie Kennedy, thanking him for the music that day. The letter is in the Library of Congress. You can look at it online.
In 1968, your dad worked on creating a show with Jerome Robbins based on a play by Bertolt Brecht. Didn't they complete that project?
They did not complete that project. The idea was to make a sort of edgy, hilarious musical comedy out of this little play of Bertolt Brecht that was very didactic. It was called he had a series of little plays called Lehrstücks, which are like teaching plays. And so they were very kind of, shaking its finger at you. They were supposed to teach you about how oppression works in the world. They were very like that, very earnest. And this particular story was about the exploitation of Chinese workers by these merchants who were competing to get to this town first to catch the oil, ticket, right? And it was very didactic. And also it was, they were using some, what we would now consider very inappropriate humor that bordered on being racist. And so what with one thing and another, they totally withdrew it and never finished it.
Wow. I want to ask you about your dad's groundbreaking and magnificent piece called Mass. You said that by writing that piece, your dad took himself off the serious composer list for good. Why?
Oh, because it was so melodic, so tonal. In the middle of the 20th century, if you wanted to be considered a so-called serious composer by the halls of academe, you absolutely positively had to write 12-tone music. That is, music that had no key and did not have what we would identify or recognize as a tune that you maybe could hum later. Like, that was not allowed because there was this straitjacket that the academic music world was in about 12-tone music. And my father was perfectly capable of writing 12-tone music, and he wrote a lot of it. I just mentioned earlier about how much 12-tone music is in his Symphony Number 3 Kaddish, but not to the exclusion of other kinds of music. And so, my father would use 12-tone elements in his pieces, but only for a while, and then eventually he would, default to a nice tune. But the moment he wrote a melody is the moment that he knew he was forfeiting his chances of being included in the musical academic pantheon.
And look how wrong he was.
Well, he got the last laugh for sure. Because once that straitjacket came off and the halls of musical academe once again were able to include tonal music in the music that they accepted as worthwhile or worthy of their attention, eventually that meant that Bernstein music was revisited and re-embraced. And today's so-called serious composers who are permitted to write in any flavor they want, they look to Leonard Bernstein as a role model for the way they write music, which is to say they can use any and all elements they want and mix them all together in any way, shape, or form they want, and that's what Bernstein did.
Exactly. I was fascinated, Jamie, by something you wrote about your father's body of work. You said, I'm quoting you here, there's a line that can be traced through so many Bernstein pieces, showing one iteration after another of his crisis of faith, his lifelong battle with his spiritual creator. Jamie, which of his compositions do you think most reflect that crisis of faith?
Oh, there are so many of them. It really is something you can track right through his life, through his musical works, starting with his Symphony Number 1, Jeremiah, which has a last movement in which there is a text from the Old Testament in which you hear a lot of rage and a kind of fist shaking at the heavens. You know, if you're up there taking care of us, why is everything such a mess down here? And why are we all so terrible to each other? So we hear it in that Symphony Number 1, but then we hear it again in so many other pieces, most notably in Symphony Number 3, Kaddish, and also in Chichester Psalms, Why Do the Nations Rage? As opposed to The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, you know, juxtaposed against each other. And so again, it's this, you know, searching for goodness and purity in the human race while also observing and thrashing over all of the discord. And by the way, that 12-tone element that my father liked to use, he often used it to express the discordance, literally, and the struggle of the human race and how they try to rise above their discord and find the place where everyone comes together. And in West Side Story, you really hear it. You just in that one song, Somewhere, in the opening notes of Somewhere, there's a place for us, that upward reaching interval with Sondheim's lyric, it just expresses all humankind's longing to rise above its discord and find a place where we all get along and take care of each other and our planet.
Which is why, of course, his music is so timeless and always relevant. Now, at one time, Francis Ford Coppola wanted to make a musical film with your dad called Tucker, but your dad said no. Do you know why?
Well, it is true that they explored this possibility for a minute. And Francis Ford Coppola actually came to our house for dinner. And so there was this evening with Coppola in our midst, and it was apparent to us in no time flat that the two of them were never going to be able to sit in a room together because those two egos were too enormous. And they were just not going to be able to, for one to make room for the other. It was just clear that this was just never going to get off the ground. So that never happened. But Coppola did make his Tucker film with someone else composing the music. And who was it? I can't remember.
I can't either, but I do get the comment about the egos. I can only imagine. You know, one of my favorite performances of your dad's was on November 9th, 1989, when he attended the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. He conducted two performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, one in East Berlin and one in West Berlin. The whole world watched it on TV on Christmas Day. Was that one of the highlights of his career?
It sure was. So yeah, it was Christmas Day of 1989 when he conducted Beethoven's Ninth in newly reunited Berlin. And it was such an exciting event. And for that one occasion, my father asked the soloists and the chorus to change the word Freude, the ode to joy, Freude, to freedom, Freiheit, just for that one day. And he said he was pretty sure Beethoven wouldn't mind. And I'm sure he's right, because Beethoven also, in his music, was constantly striving to express mankind's wish to be united and joyous and at peace one with the other. So for my father, who spent his whole life trying to make the world a better place with his music making, in this last year of his life, he didn't live to the next Christmas, but on that Christmas day, it was such a great culmination of all his lifelong efforts to use his music making to make the world, try to make the world a better place, and to express all the elements of humankind that were the good parts, which we can hear in good music.
Oh, yes. And it was such a hopeful evening. It was so cathartic and redemptive. It was one of my favorite performances of your dad's. Now, you and your family were living in the famous New York apartment building, the Dakota, and you were actually home when John Lennon was shot. Did you
Yes,
ever get to know John Lennon?
we got to know him a little bit. I mean, he was a neighbor. He showed up at the building's potluck in the courtyard, and that was so exciting because I was a lifelong John Lennon fanatic, a Beatlemaniac from the beginning, but John Lennon was my favorite. And so I was beside myself to be standing next to him where all the desserts were arrayed. And he was trying to decide which one to have. And I actually heard John Lennon say, "I want something mushy and disgusting." And I thought, I've just gone to heaven right now.
God bless him. Now, when your dad got the Kennedy Center honor, you performed your song, Thank You for the Big Heart, which you co-wrote with David Pack. I know you suffered from terrible stage fright in those days, but were you happy with your performance? Because you did a great job.
Oh, thank you. I didn't think I did a great job, but at least I got through it without, you know, fainting or something. But
I,
when I came off the stage, my hands were buzzing and tingling and kind of got all frozen. I called it dead chickenitis because my hands, it was just a weird adrenaline reaction. Luckily, it happened after I was finished and not while I was on the stage.
well, what
Which,
you couldn't see until you watched it on TV yourself was your father's reactions to your performances, which the camera kept going to. So it was a very poignant performance. I remember it distinctly, and really, you did do a great job, Jamie.
I'm glad to hear it. Yes, my dad liked it a lot.
I'm fascinated by what you wrote in your book about Jamie Bernstein, the songwriter. You said that your career as a songwriter and musician was doomed from the beginning because you didn't have what you called the golden blind spot that every successful music artist has. Can you explain to us what is the golden blind spot?
Yeah. It's the name I cooked up for. It's not just musicians. I would say any creative artist needs to be able to live in this sort of bubble of illusion or delusion that whatever they're working on at a given moment has great significance and is really wonderful and important and will matter in the world. Because if you can't believe that long enough to get through what you're creating, you'll probably set it aside and not have the stamina to see it through to its conclusion. You have to believe in it long enough to finish it. And I could kind of have that illusion for myself long enough to write a song, but in the long run, I couldn't sustain the illusion that what I was doing had any significance in the world when compared to what my father was doing. comparisons are odious, you know?
Oh, for sure. You know, what I find fascinating is that you had great difficulty writing commercial hit songs, but you wrote a number of songs for your dad that you performed on special occasions, like at the Kennedy Center. And you wrote an a cappella piece called the Maestro Suite that you performed in Paris. And you wrote a song called the 7-0 Stomp that you performed at Tanglewood for your dad's 70th birthday. Why was it so easy to write songs for your dad, but not for the commercial market?
Oh, right. I loved writing songs for him because he got such a kick out of them. And it was a great way to tease him, was to write these sort of songs that roasted my dad. And it was so rewarding to make fun of him and to write songs for him that were so full of love and to see how delighted he was by them. So that kind of took the onus off the whole thing, I guess.
But didn't you have the confidence to see that that same skill in creating these melodies and writing these lyrics were transferable to the commercial market? Or
Well, I
was it just
tried.
a confidence thing?
It was the problem was that, whatever confidence I may have had, which was already compromised, really fell apart once I had actually gotten the record deal. And I made the recording and I submitted it to the record company and they listened to it and they announced that they didn't like it and they were not going to release it. The end. And that was such a vote of no confidence.
Yeah.
That it was such a blow that at that point I thought, well, I guess it was true after all that I'm no good and I'm just going to crawl away from the wreckage now.
And look
And
how
so,
wrong record companies have been wrong so many times.
yes, they have, but whether they were wrong or right, all I can tell you is I just couldn't take it anymore and I moved on. But then a funny thing happened some years later, after my father had died. I was invited to create a young people's concert like the ones my father used to do, but about him. And I wound up dividing my father's job into two parts. And I did the writing part. And my friend Michael Barrett, who was actually a conductor and had worked with my dad, he would do the musical part. And then together we could do what my father was able to do all by himself. And our young people's concert that we created, the Bernstein Beat, turned out to be such a hit that we were invited to write many more of these kinds of educational concerts. And then I was invited to create concerts with narrations for adult audiences as well. And I was doing more and more of this. And then one day, about 15 years later, I realized, hey, is this my career? And I had inadvertently found a solution to my problem: to stay in the world of music by talking about music, but not actually making it with my own body. And that allowed me to have a musician's life on the road, at rehearsals, the adrenaline of performance and getting together afterwards, all that fun stuff, just not making the music with my own body. Worked out great.
Yeah, that's what you call a great destiny. Now, as you know, the FBI had an 800-page file on your dad. In fact, it's well known that J. Edgar Hoover was obsessed with your father. Did you ever find out why?
Oh, no, I have a theory, though. You want to hear my theory?
Yeah.
Yeah, my crackpot theory is that J. Edgar Hoover had a little crush on Leonard Bernstein. So he liked to play cat and mouse with him, make his life a little difficult, keep tabs on him all the time, but never actually disenfranchise him from pursuing his career altogether. So, I mean, we could draw a comparison to the way Stalin tormented Shostakovich, except it wasn't quite as toxic as that. But similarly, Stalin never put Shostakovich out of business, never actually arrested him and put him in a gulag, even though Shostakovich thought it was imminent constantly and used to spend the night dressed in his coat on the steps of his house with a packed bag so that when they came to pick him up, he wouldn't bother his family. That never happened to my dad, but our phone was tapped for sure. And when my father, when my mother gave that fundraising event to raise money for the Black Panther 21 who were in jail on trumped up charges that were thrown out on day one of the trial, but still needed help before that day one of the trial came. After that incident, which was written up about in that snarky way by Tom Wolfe, everybody thought it was Lenny's party, and it was my mother's event, and it wasn't a party. But anyway, the hate mail poured in, and the Jewish Defense League was picketing outside our building. Through that 800-page FBI file, when we finally got to see it in the 1980s, we discovered the hate mail was written by the FBI. And those picketers outside our building were full of FBI plants to make their numbers bigger. So it was like that.
Yeah, well, J. Edgar Hoover wasn't the only person that had a crush on your dad. Your dad had enormous sex appeal. He exuded a tremendous sexual energy and effervescence and flamboyance. In your book, you wrote very frankly about coming to terms with your father's sexuality, and in particular, his gay relationships. You said that as a young adult, you were conflicted. You wanted to know, but you also didn't want to know. Was it difficult to accept that part of your dad's identity?
Well, it just happened very slowly, and we're talking about the 1960s and 70s, and that was early times. It wasn't like now where these issues could be talked about and we had the vocabulary. We didn't. And things were still very much still in the closet back then. And so the process by which my brother and sister and I gradually came to understand that our father had this other side of his life, it happened very gradually in very small increments. And there was never a moment when our dad sat us down and said, "Listen, kids, I have something to tell you." It was never like that. It was just little by little by little. And then suddenly it was a sort of given. But there was never a moment when it was all planted in front of us. It just came slowly and very much without the vocabulary to discuss it or the context.
Well, those of us gay men from that generation certainly can relate to everything you've just said. And of course, we relate very strongly to the movie Maestro. For me, the real hero in your book and in the movie is your incredible mom, the actress, pianist, painter, Felicia Montealegre. She was truly an extraordinary human being. It's obvious that it couldn't always have been easy being Mrs. Maestro all the time. And it's clear that, tell me if I've got this right, this is how I felt, that although she adored your father, she loved him very, very much, but there was some essential part of her that was not being nourished in that marriage. That's really painful for all of us who could identify with what she was going through.
I think you're right. And that's why it's a very sad story about our mother. I think she got so much out of her partnership with her husband, and look at the life she created for all of us. The graciousness and the conviviality and the beauty and the fun, and all of that is real. And she was the one who really created that environment for all of us and for herself too. But it's at the same time true that there was something missing for her that ultimately grew more and more painful as the years went by. So it was tough for her, yes.
Well, she passed away tragically of cancer. She was only 56. And one of the last things she ever said to you was that all anyone ever needed in this world was to be sensitive and kind to others. She really stressed the importance of kindness. What a legacy, Jamie, that she left you.
It's true. And, it makes me smile a little, even as she was dying. I think she was able to access her sense of drama because she was such a good actress. And I believe she knew how powerful it would be for her to lie in that bed and hold my hand and say, kindness, kindness, kindness. It was so dramatic and also so deeply meaningful. I feel like, she gave me this moral compass all the way back when I was 24 years old. And really, I was a kid at that age still. And it was a beautiful thing to say to a daughter.
I don't know if you're aware of this, but anyone who talks to anybody who knows you, and in doing my research, of course, I did that. That's the first word that people use to describe you as a person is how kind you are.
No.
And that's really very,
Cry.
very, very meaningful to me that last message she gave you, you've honored her by living that message in the way you conduct yourself with other people. It's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. I hope so. I'm pretty sure I've fallen down on the job sometimes, but it was a great message to get so early in life, truly.
Now, shortly after your mom passed away, there was a big star-studded 60th birthday event for your dad at Wolf Trap, which was televised. I remember seeing him crying on stage. I couldn't understand what was happening. What do you think was going through his mind at that moment?
Oh, my memory of that 60th birthday was that we were all a mess because we had only lost our mother, and in my father's case, his wife, mere months earlier. And we were still kind of shaking. And my father was so miserable that he still had to go through with this event because there were so many forces involved and it was being televised and there was no backing out of it, right? He had to do it and he was so not up for it. And so his crying was probably a mixture of many things, including just how devastated he still was to have lost Felicia under the circumstances that he lost her. And he was so guilty too. He felt that somehow he had brought it all on by having broken her heart during their brief separation, and all of what went down with his bringing his other side of life into the family. He felt very guilty about the whole thing.
Did you and your siblings try to alleviate that guilt, or did you kind of agree with him that he had every reason to feel guilty? It wasn't the nicest thing to do.
Well, it's true that it wasn't the nicest thing to do, but it was also true that he was our dad and we loved him and we were still a family and a very close-knit family. That's the thing. Whatever misdeeds might have occurred amongst all of us, we were still a family that was very closely knit and clinging to each other, all the more in the absence of our mother and, in our father's case, his wife. We clung to each other all the more.
Of course. Over the years, there have been a lot of books written about your dad. There was a coffee table book published in 1968 called The Private World of Leonard Bernstein. And there was a rather salacious book by Joan Pizer called Bernstein, a biography. And there was also a biography by Humphrey Burton. Are there any books about your dad that you would recommend besides your own?
I would recommend, well, the Humphrey Burton biography is the most thorough and all-encompassing of all the biographies, of which there are many. The one that's my personal favorite is by Alan Shawn, who wrote a beautiful, it's not a big tome, it's a rather modest-sized book, but it's really beautifully written, and it has some really great writing about my father's music. And the book starts with the greatest anecdote about my father's childhood. It begins with the story of my father, like age, 4 or something, who heard that man was made from dust, that God made man out of dust. So he decided he was going to make a man. And his parents were not in the house. So he took a whole bunch of dust and put it in the bathtub and turned on the water, and then sort of went off and did something else and didn't turn off the water in the bathtub, and there was a giant flood into the tailor shop downstairs, and that caused my father's parents to be evicted from their apartment. Great story, right? See,
Wow.
thinking big, even as a kid.
Even as a kid.
So that's in the Alan Shawn book. I really recommend it.
In 1982, Harper's Magazine published an article by Leon Botstein called The Tragedy of Leonard Bernstein. He said your father had an insatiable need for adulation and for instant and perpetual acclaim. What did you think of that article?
Well, we really hated that article. I
Me
mean,
too.
there were elements in it that had, grains of truth or accuracy, but it was all set in this incredibly snarky context. And I will tell you that Leon Botstein grew to regret having written that article, and he wrote my brother and sister and me an email in the centennial in 2018 apologizing for having written it and saying that he really felt that he was trying to make a name for himself and was acting splashy, and that he really regretted now having written what he said back then. So for what that's worth.
Well, I think that apology should be more public, because I can tell you when I read it, I couldn't believe it. I mean, if you're a child of our generation and you grew up with Leonard Bernstein and the young people's concerts, it's very hard to read that, because that's not the Leonard Bernstein we know. Of course, he had an ego. He's a creator. He's in show business. But I thought the article reeked of jealousy, to be honest.
Yeah, I bet Leon Botstein would agree with you now.
Well, of course, I have to ask you about the movie Maestro. I assume you're happy with Bradley Cooper's performance?
We are, there was no telling how this film was going to come out. I think we lucked out so incredibly with the way Bradley Cooper took on the project and the way he opened his heart to who our father was and who our family was. And it's funny, we didn't particularly observe this in the beginning, but as the project went along, it began to occur to us that Bradley Cooper was actually a lot like Leonard Bernstein in reality, the way he was so all-embracing and how he would create this very warm, loving environment for everyone he worked with. Because of the SAG strike, Bradley and his co-star Carrie Mulligan were not able to show up for any of the film festivals where the film was shown. They weren't allowed to do anything promotional. That was the SAG rule. And so instead, Netflix sent around members of the team that made the film. So, the art director and the editor and the costume guy and the makeup guy, all these people, and my brother and sister and me. And we appeared together on a lot of panels and Q&A situations. And that was how we found out from these members of the film team that Bradley created this incredibly safe, trusting, warm, all-embracing environment that made them all feel like they could express themselves at their best and take risks and be safe. And we were astonished. That was how we found out that the Bradley had the same approach to his work, the same work ethic, really, that our father had. It was amazing to discover.
What do you think your dad would think of the movie?
Yeah, we get asked that question, and we think our dad would love the movie because, hey, everybody's paying attention to him, and he loved the attention. And also, I think he would really respect that Bradley went to the lengths he went to tell this story from this context of love. But when it comes to our mother, Felicia, she was so much more of a private person and a more shy and not necessarily seeking the public eye. So we think maybe she might have been a little uncomfortable. However, we do think she would have vastly respected Carrie Mulligan's performance, which is so astonishing. She's just amazing. And she had so much less to go on when it came to researching the character than Bradley, who had, so much video and so much of everything to study. There was much less to go on for Carrie when she researched Felicia, and somehow she just channeled our mother. I don't know how she did it. It's kind of a magic trick.
She did something even more than that. I mean, you know that she channeled your mother because you knew your mother. I think for the audience, what's fascinating and quite compelling is the way that with very little dialogue, she can convey through her face the pain, the love, the anguish, and of course, the reality that her life was going to end much too soon. This question may be a bit difficult to answer, but after seeing the movie, I can't help asking you this question because I would think it might be important to you. Do you think the movie will make people like your father as a person?
Wow, that is an interesting question. I would hope so. I would hope so. I mean, it shows him very much as a complicated human being and a complicated, loving human being, and with a lot of sides and a lot of complexities and above all, my father's music, which saturates the soundtrack. And that I think that goes a really long way in conveying my father's humanity, because his music was so him. It really has his DNA in it, and you can just feel the warmth of him and the passion and the enormous heart of him. You can hear it in his music. And so I think it was very wise of Bradley to use so much Bernstein music in the underscoring, because it's telling you everything. And that adds a lot to Bradley's performance.
Oh, absolutely. I want to tell our viewers that you can learn more about Jamie Bernstein and see her personal appearance schedule by going to her official website, jamiebernstein.net. Well, Jamie, I only have one more question for you. Are you ready?
Okay.
You wrote that your father was a natural born teacher and that he was almost constantly trying to teach his children things. What would you say was the most important thing you learned from your dad?
Oh, well, I would say one of the most precious elements that my brother and sister and I got from our dad was laughter. My father loved a good joke more than anything. And he remembered every joke he ever heard, every vaudeville routine he ever saw, and he shared all of that with us. He loved Laurel and Hardy. He loved Lewis Carroll. He loved to laugh. And so the laughter was really such a powerful glue that kept our family together, because we had so many private jokes and even a private language, and everything had this undercurrent of yumminess, because we could all make each other laugh in our private special ways. And that was a tremendous gift that still lives with my brother and sister and me, and now we're passing all of that along to our kids.
I love that. Well, Jamie, it's been such a pleasure meeting you and having this chance to chat with you. Thank you so much for sharing your life with us through your book.
Oh,
And for
thank you,
everything.
Harvey, and thank you for knowing so much about everything. I mean, boy, you did some homework.
Well, it was easy to do. I've been a huge fan of your father's and his music my whole life. I'm so proud of everything you do to honor your father's monumental legacy. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Thank you a lot. Appreciate it.
Our guest has been the wonderful Jamie Bernstein, daughter of the legendary composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein. The movie about her father, entitled Maestro, can now be seen on Netflix. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to my producer, Steve Silver, my director of programming, Deborah Batsafin, my production assistant, Rosa Puzo, my PR directors, Eileen Shapiro and Jimmy Starr, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.